Let me tell you about something that happened to me a while back when I was working in retail. It's one of those experiences that sticks with you, and no matter how much time passes, you just can't shake the feeling it left behind. I used to work at this small clothing store, and like most retail jobs, it was pretty routine. Nothing special, nothing overly exciting. But one night, while I was working a late shift, things got weird. The store was small, and there weren't many of us on staff. On a typical day, we'd have two people at the register, one person on the floor, and then someone in the back room organizing stock or handling deliveries. That back room, though, it was one of those places that felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. No windows, poor lighting, and a faint smell of cardboard and cleaning supplies that never seemed to go away. I never liked being back there alone, but sometimes you just had to deal with it. It was a Thursday night, and the store was pretty dead. We were an hour away from closing, and it was just me and one other guy, Steve, working that night. Steve was up front handling the register, while I was in the back, sorting through a delivery that had come in earlier that day. Normally, we'd handle deliveries during the day, but we'd been short-staffed, so it got pushed to the night shift. The back room was cold, like always, and the overhead fluorescent lights flickered every now and then. I'd been back there for about 30 minutes, opening boxes and stacking things on the shelves, when I heard this noise. It was faint at first, like something small being dragged across the floor. I paused for a second, listening, but the noise stopped, so I figured it was nothing. Probably just one of the boxes shifting, or maybe the air conditioning kicking on. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, a definite scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. Now I know this back room like the back of my hand. There's nothing back there that would make that kind of noise unless someone or something was moving it. My first thought was that maybe Steve had come to the back for something and was messing around. He had a habit of pulling pranks on people, especially when it was slow. "Steve?" I called out, but there was no response. I shrugged it off and went back to work, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but that uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The back room was quiet again, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. About 15 minutes later, as I was finishing up the last box, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a noise. It was a thud, like something had fallen over. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened, waiting for the noise to come again, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I walked toward the far corner of the back room, where we kept the older stock that hadn't been touched in months. The air felt colder the closer I got, and I could feel this tightness in my chest, like something was squeezing the breath out of me. I told myself it was just nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I shone the light around the shelves, I noticed something odd. One of the boxes had been moved, just slightly, but enough that it caught my attention. It was like someone had pushed it, but there was no one back there except me. I walked closer, trying to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. There was a door behind the boxes. Now, I'd been working in that store for over a year, and I'd never seen that door before. It was tucked away in the farthest corner, hidden behind a stack of boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in ages. The door itself was old, with peeling paint and a rusted handle, like it hadn't been opened in years. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and grabbed the handle. It was cold, colder than the room, which was already freezing, and when I pulled, the door creaked open with a sound that sent chills down my spine. Behind the door was a narrow hallway, pitch black and silent. I shone my phone's flashlight down the hallway, but the light barely reached the end. The walls were made of rough, unfinished concrete, and the air smelled damp and musty, like the place hadn't been ventilated in years. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should go in. Every instinct was telling me to close the door and walk away, but something about that hallway pulled me in. I wanted to know where it led, why it was hidden, and what was at the end of it. I stepped inside. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing against the walls. My footsteps echoed off the concrete floor, and the further I went, the colder it got. The air was thick, and it felt like every breath I took was being sucked out of my lungs. I kept walking, shining my flashlight ahead of me, but the end of the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. After what felt like an eternity, I reached another door. This one was different. It was newer, with a metal frame and a small window at the top, but the glass was so dirty I couldn't see through it. I reached for the handle, but just as I was about to pull, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffling sound, like something moving in the dark. I spun around, shining my flashlight back down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the empty corridor stretching back to the back room. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead, despite how cold it was. I turned back to the door and pulled it open. Inside was a small room, maybe the size of a closet. The walls were lined with shelves, and on the shelves were stacks of old papers and files. In the center of the room was a single chair, metal and rusted, sitting under a bare light bulb that flickered weakly. I stepped inside, feeling this overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The room smelled old, like mildew and dust, and the air was even colder than the hallway. I looked around, trying to make sense of what this room was doing here, but nothing added up. The papers on the shelves were covered in dust, and some of them looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. As I stood there, trying to piece it all together, I heard the door behind me creak shut. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but the door was closed, just like before. I ran to it, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. That's when I saw it. Standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. My heart stopped, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at it, frozen in place. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and into the back room. I slammed the hidden door shut behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the handle. I didn't look back. I just grabbed my stuff and headed straight for the front of the store. Steve was still up front, completely unaware of what had just happened. He gave me a weird look when I told him I was leaving early, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I never told anyone about the door or what I saw in the hallway. Part of me still wonders if it was real or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. But every time I think about going back there, I get this sinking feeling in my stomach, like something is still waiting for me. Needless to say, I quit that job a few weeks later. I couldn't handle being in that back room anymore, especially at night. And even now, whenever I walk by that store, I can't help but glance at the back, wondering if the door is still there, hidden behind the boxes, waiting for someone else to find it. Alright, let me tell you about something that happened to me when I was working at this small store. I still think about it sometimes, and even though it's been a while, it gives me chills every time I remember it. I was working at a local retail shop, a small place, nothing fancy. We sold random stuff like clothes, basic groceries, and household items. You know the type of place where you're on a first-name basis with most of the customers because they come in every other day? That's the kind of store it was. The store had this back room where we kept all the stock, extra items that didn't fit on the shelves, cleaning supplies, and random things we didn't need every day. I'd only been working there for a few months, but I'd gotten used to being back there. It wasn't a scary place or anything, but the lights were always kind of dim, and it smelled like cardboard and dust. The back room was bigger than it needed to be for the size of the store, and it always felt a little empty and echoey. But again, I didn't think much of it. So one night, I was closing the store with my coworker, Sarah. We were the only two working that shift, and it had been a pretty slow evening. By around 8:30 p.m., there were no customers left, and we started getting things ready to close at 9 p.m. Sarah was handling the register up front while I was supposed to go back into the storeroom and organize a few boxes that had been delivered earlier in the day. I grabbed the keys and headed toward the back. I opened the heavy metal door that led into the back room, and like always, it was darker than I'd like. The lights were those flickering fluorescent ones that buzz constantly, which just adds to the weird vibe of the room. I flicked the switch, and the lights came on with that annoying hum, but they weren't much help. They left a lot of shadowy corners in the room. I started moving some boxes around, stacking them on shelves, and trying to organize the mess that had built up over the past week. I had my phone out, playing some music to keep myself distracted from how quiet it was back there. After a few minutes though, I noticed something odd. There was this soft sound, almost like a shuffle or a faint knock, coming from the far corner of the back room. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The noise was faint, but I definitely heard something. I brushed it off at first, figuring it was just the building settling, or maybe something shifting on the shelves. I mean, this was an old building, and it creaked and groaned all the time, so I went back to organizing the boxes. But then I heard it again. This time it was a little louder, like something had fallen over. I turned off the music on my phone and stood still, listening. It came from the farthest corner of the room, the one we never really used. We stored old supplies there, stuff that we almost never touched. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a box shifting or something. Still, curiosity got the better of me. So I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and started walking toward the corner. The closer I got, the colder it felt in the room. I don't know if it was the temperature actually dropping or just my nerves, but it felt like the air was suddenly freezing. When I reached the corner, everything looked normal at first. Just boxes stacked against the wall, nothing out of place. But then I noticed something that made my heart race a little faster. One of the shelves that had been pushed up against the wall wasn't completely flush anymore. It had been moved, just slightly, but enough that there was now a small gap between the shelf and the wall. I crouched down, trying to look behind the shelf, and that's when I saw it. There was a door. I had no idea this door even existed. I'd been back here countless times, and I'd never seen it before. It was hidden behind the shelf, like someone had deliberately tried to cover it up. The door was old too, made of metal, with rust creeping up around the edges, and there was no handle, just a latch. My first thought was that this must have been some kind of maintenance access, or maybe even an emergency exit, but it didn't look like it had been used in years. Now, any normal person probably would have just left it alone. But me? I was too curious for my own good. I reached out, grabbed the latch, and pulled. The door creaked open, and I was hit with this wave of musty, stale air. It smelled like the inside of an old attic, damp and forgotten. I shone my flashlight inside, and what I saw gave me serious second thoughts about continuing. It was a small, narrow hallway, barely wide enough for me to walk through. The walls were concrete, rough and unfinished, and the floor was uneven, like it had been hastily thrown together. The air inside was cold, much colder than the back room, and the weirdest part, there was no sound. It was dead silent in there, like the hallway absorbed all the noise. I hesitated for a second, but my curiosity got the best of me. I stepped inside, shining the light down the hallway. It didn't go far, maybe 20 or 30 feet, but at the end, there was another door. This one looked even older than the first. The paint was peeling, and there were scratches on it, like someone had been clawing at the door from the inside. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and the further I went, the more I wanted to turn around and leave. But something kept me moving forward. When I reached the door, I grabbed the handle and pulled. It opened with a groan, revealing a small room beyond. The room was completely empty, except for a single wooden chair sitting in the middle of the floor. The walls were bare concrete, and there were no windows, no lights, just my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I walked into the room, my footsteps sounding way too loud. The air was even colder in here, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. I looked around, trying to figure out what the hell this room was for, but there was nothing. Just that chair, sitting in the center of the room like it had been placed there on purpose. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a noise behind me. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My stomach dropped. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it again. The scraping was coming from the far wall, near the corner. It sounded like metal against concrete, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the corner of the room, waiting for something to happen. And then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like forever. I finally snapped out of it and backed toward the door, keeping my flashlight trained on the corner. I didn't want to turn my back on that room for a second. I reached the door, stepped into the hallway, and pulled it shut behind me. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran down the hallway, back to the first door, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my phone. I stood there for a second, trying to process what had just happened, but all I knew was that I needed to get out of there. I left the back room and went straight to the front of the store, where Sarah was still closing out the register. She looked up at me, confused, and asked if I was okay. I told her I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. She didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I grabbed my stuff and got the hell out of there. I didn't go back to that store for a while after that. I called in sick the next few shifts and eventually quit. I never told anyone about the door or the room or what I'd heard in there. To this day, I still wonder what the hell that room was and why it was hidden behind that shelf. Sometimes, late at night, I think about going back to see if the door is still there. But then I remember the sound of that scraping and I decide it's better to just let it be. Alright, so this is one of those stories that I still think about sometimes, and it gives me chills. It happened when I was working at a small retail store in my town. I've been working there for about 6 months at the time, just doing typical retail stuff like stocking shelves, running the cash register, and occasionally organizing the back room. Now, the back room wasn't exactly the kind of place you wanted to spend a lot of time in. It wasn't spooky per se, but it was dimly lit, cold, and always felt a little off. The fluorescent lights would flicker sometimes, and there was this constant low buzzing sound, probably from some old electrical wiring. It was just uncomfortable. But, it's part of the job, so I got used to it. It was a regular Wednesday, pretty quiet, and I was working the closing shift with my coworker, Jess. She was covering the front of the store while I was in the back, organizing some new inventory that had come in earlier that day. The back room was basically just a big concrete space, filled with metal shelves stacked with boxes, extra supplies, and cleaning products. There wasn't a lot to it, just a simple storage area. So I'm in the back, moving boxes around, trying to finish up quickly so we could close on time. It was around 8 p.m., and we had about an hour left before we'd shut the doors for the night. As I was organizing some stuff on one of the higher shelves, I heard this noise. At first, it was just a faint tapping sound, like something brushing against metal. I didn't think much of it at first. It could have been anything, maybe one of the boxes shifting or something falling over. I kept working, but then the noise came again, louder this time. It was a distinct asterisk thud asterisk, like something heavy had been dropped or pushed. I stood still for a second, listening. The back room was silent except for the buzzing of the lights overhead, and there was no one else back there with me. Jess was still up front with the cash register. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably nothing, and kept working. I'd gotten through about half the boxes when I heard it again, this time followed by a scraping sound, like metal dragging across the floor. It was coming from the far corner of the back room, behind some old shelving units that were mostly used for storage. Now, I knew the back room pretty well, and there wasn't supposed to be anything back there that could make that kind of noise. It was just old boxes and some cleaning supplies that hadn't been touched in months. My first thought was that maybe something had fallen over, but the scraping sound didn't fit with that. It was too deliberate, like someone or something was moving around back there. At this point, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I mean, it's not like I thought there was someone back there. It's a secure store, and Jess would have said something if anyone else had come in. But the back room had always had this strange, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. And now, with these weird noises, I was starting to get that creeping feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed toward the corner where the noise had come from. The back of the room was darker, the overhead lights barely reaching that far. As I walked closer, the air felt colder, and I could see a thin layer of dust covering most of the boxes stacked against the wall. Nothing looked out of place. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. One of the shelving units wasn't quite flush against the wall like the others. It was slightly pulled away, leaving just enough space for someone, if they were small enough, to slip behind it. I crouched down and looked through the gap, shining my flashlight into the dark space behind the shelf. And that's when I saw it. There was a door. It wasn't like the heavy metal door we used to get in and out of the back room. This one was old, wooden, with chipped paint and a rusted handle. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I blinked, confused. I'd been working in that store for months, and I'd never noticed this door before. In fact, I was pretty sure it wasn't supposed to be there at all. I stared at it for a minute, debating whether or not to open it. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but my curiosity got the best of me. I pulled the shelf aside just enough to squeeze through, and with one last glance behind me, to make sure no one was watching, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. The walls were concrete, the floor uneven, and the air smelled damp and musty, like the space hadn't been ventilated in years. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, but I couldn't see much beyond the first few feet. It just stretched into darkness. I hesitated for a second, thinking maybe I should just shut the door and walk away. But there was something about the hallway that drew me in. It was like finding a hidden part of the store that no one knew about, like discovering a secret. So I stepped inside. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing against the walls. As I moved further in, the air grew colder, and the sound of the buzzing lights in the back room faded away until it was completely silent. It felt like I was walking into a different world, one that had been sealed off from everything else for who knows how long. After what felt like a minute or two of walking, I reached the end of the hallway. There was another door, this one metal, with no handle, just a rusted latch. My hands were shaking a little as I reached out and pulled it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, maybe the size of a walk-in closet. The walls were bare concrete, and there was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, though it wasn't turned on. In the middle of the room was a wooden table with a few old yellowed papers scattered on top. There was also a chair, but it was tipped over on its side, like someone had knocked it over in a hurry. I stepped inside, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a blanket. The room smelled old, like dust and mold, and the silence was almost suffocating. I walked over to the table and picked up one of the papers, but the writing was faded and hard to make out. It looked like some kind of inventory list, but none of the items were familiar, just strange numbers and symbols that didn't make any sense. As I was standing there, trying to make sense of it, I heard the door behind me slam shut. I jumped, dropping the paper, and spun around. The door was closed, just like before, but now there was something different about it. The latch was on the outside, meaning I was locked in. My heart started racing as I ran to the door, banging on it and calling out for Jess, hoping she'd hear me. But the walls were thick, and there was no way my voice was getting through. I was trapped. For a few minutes, I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to figure out what to do. My phone's flashlight was still on, casting long shadows on the walls, and the cold air felt like it was closing in on me. That's when I heard it again. The scraping sound, only this time it was coming from inside the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint at first, like something dragging across the floor, but it was getting closer. I shone my flashlight around the room, but there was nothing there. Just the empty table, the tipped-over chair, and the bare concrete walls. The sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. I didn't know what was making the noise, and I didn't want to find out. I banged on the door again, harder this time, yelling for help, but the sound kept coming, scraping across the floor, like something was crawling toward me. I backed into the corner of the room, my phone shaking in my hand. The light flickered for a second, and then, just as the noise reached the middle of the room, it stopped. The room was silent again, except for the sound of my own breathing. I stood there for what felt like forever, too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. And then, after what must have been minutes, the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see what, or who, had opened it. I bolted down the hallway, back into the back room, and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I ran to the front of the store, where Jess was still standing at the register, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my stuff, told her I was leaving early, and walked out of the store as fast as I could. To this day, I still don't know what that room was or why it was hidden behind that door in the back room. I quit that job not long after, and I've never been back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that scraping sound and wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in that room just a little longer.